Management skills is a fiddly little topic because every textbook sort of comes up with different skills and sort of defines them differently, but that's not what's important. What's important is more how you apply them. So looking at some possible exam questions, look, you might get asked to define each one, probably unlikely, but more likely you'll get asked to describe or explain or outline the skills a particular manager needs to use. We'll give you a case study and it might say you've got to fire a bunch of people. What skills would you use? Or if you need to implement change, what skills should you use? And probably this is the most important thing. You need to describe, explain, or outline the relationship between the management style being used and the skills the manager needs to use. And lastly, maybe you need to propose and justify, say, 2 skills a manager should use in a particular situation. So every textbook is different. Doesn't really matter, but what we came up with was 6 skills: communication, delegation, planning, leading, decision-making, interpersonal, but every textbook's different. The study design doesn't have a set list or anything. But we came up with each and we sort of defined each one. Communication, we said creating and exchanging info, and specifically what does it involve? Personal communication, but also internal communication inside the business, but also with external people, communicating between managers and say customers or the public. Delegation, that's when you pass authority to people lower down so they can perform tasks or make decisions. So specifically, what does it involve? Determining what should be delegated, nominating people to do it, and monitoring and encouraging them. Planning, a formalized decision-making process that is future-oriented. So making decisions for the future, basically. What does it involve? Setting goals, developing action plans to reach the goals, and then evaluating and reviewing whether your plans worked. We have leading, when the manager guides workers towards achieving the goals of the business. Specifically, it involves motivating, engaging, and inspiring people, acting as a role model, building teams, resolving conflicts. Decision making, where a selection is made between a range of different alternatives, but specifically, what does it involve? Identifying the problem, gathering info, coming up with possible solutions, picking one, and then evaluating your decision. And lastly, interpersonal skills, the skills used every day to communicate and interact with people both individually and in groups. So what does that involve? Being a team player, but being empathetic, I think, is a really big thing as a boss, and being a good communicator. Also being someone that other people can look at and respect, so you respect them and they respect you. So that's sort of really dry, right? So what you might need to do, more likely, is say, if you say, I think they should use this management style, well, you've got to come up with some skills they should use. So we're going to group autocratic and persuasive together and say, basically, they use the same skill set. So they'll use communication. Every manager uses these skills. We're just saying, how do they use them differently? So we will say, if I'm going to use this type of management style, I'm going to be a one-way communicator. The communication is really clear. Here's what to do. Here's our goals and targets. With the planning, that's all done by the manager. So that skill is going to be heavily used by a manager. They need to plan their own time as well as the schedule for everyone else. And lastly, decision making is going to be really centralized. They're going to make all the decisions for the team, not going to delegate anything. So we don't see delegating as a skill on this list. So they must be effective at choosing from a range of alternatives. We'll group consultative and participative together because they basically use the same skill set. What sort of communication will you use? You'll need to use both one-way and two-way, mostly two-way, but sometimes specifically with consultative, you need to be one-way. You need to provide some guidance and instruction to the team, but also listen to their feedback. Delegation, you are going to use delegation here. You've got to give a lot of authority and control to teammates, to the team. And you've got to lead as well because you're kind of, overseeing people. You've got to be a really good leader. And lastly, laissez-faire, the skills you need total delegation. That's your biggest skill really, but also this one, interpersonal, because you're hands off. It's all about relationships and people. And lastly, you got to be a two-way communicator. You got to listen to people and get their feedback because ultimately they're the ones that are going to make the decisions.